Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens, and this is Carly Stevens Books for all things writing, publishing, and indie author life. Let's talk metaphors. Sometimes authors don't think about metaphors outside of English class, but they are absolutely powerful in your work, no matter what your style is, what your genre is. You don't need to be a poet or a literary writer to employ metaphors. So let's get into it. This is something that anybody can do just to spice up and make your writing way more interesting and dynamic. So I'm going to start by defining my terms. A metaphor is actually only one of two under a larger umbrella that I'm going to talk about today. So analogies are really what I'm talking about. Metaphors and similes are the two main kinds. Similes use like or as, like a cloud, as her friend, and then metaphors do not use like or as. So if you say the fingers of dawn, then that is a metaphor because it doesn't literally have fingers. We're making that analogy, but we're not using the words like or as. So along those lines, the rosy fingers of dawn, this is a Homeric epithet. I'm already getting a bit too deep into it, but in the Iliad and the Odyssey, that is a repeated descriptor. At this point, although not as many people use that metaphor as, in their works, we do see cliches in writing all the time. A cliche is just an old, tired out analogy or turn of phrase that we've seen a million times. She was off like a shot. Doesn't have the same punch as an original metaphor would because there's nothing that we're really picturing. We just think, oh, okay, so she ran fast. We don't picture like a shot, like a bullet out of a gun. It's not the same kind of experience as we have with a new metaphor where we're trying to wrap our heads around the analogy and make that connection that you, the writer, wants the reader to make. Last note before I dive on in to talking about analogies, and that is beware mixed metaphors. Mixed metaphors, that happens when you use two or more different analogies, not just an extended version of the same one where you look at different aspects of it, but two actually different analogies and you put those right next to each other. When you do that, the analogy stops having power because instead of picturing one thing and going, oh wow, that connection, your brain is going in a bunch of different directions and things stop making sense at times. The worst is when you have a mixed metaphor in the same sentence, which can happen. So if you are using analogies, just keep your eyes open for not using so many that it becomes muddy instead of clear and awesome. Okay, one of my favorite ways to use analogies is to establish tone. Tone is basically it's like the tone of voice. If you're speaking to somebody, that ominous tone or that lighthearted tone or that educational tone or whatever it is that you're trying to get across. Tone of a work is similar to that. What is the sound of it? Another way of thinking about it is like the soundtrack. What is the soundtrack behind your story? If you've seen those edits with how, different music behind a particular clip of a movie, it completely changes the tone of it. It could be funny, and then when you switch the music, it could be really frightening and ominous. So your tone can be created in a lot of different ways, but analogies are one of the best. What you do essentially with analogies is make the connection between two things in the reader's minds, and you're like, yes, of course. But that is a really powerful tool for you to connect this person, this idea, this place, this item with this association over here. You really can do an enormous amount to establish tone by creating those connections in readers' minds. If you use analogies, especially when it's alongside intentional word choice, I'm going to stick with the creepy descriptor because it is Labor Day as I film this, and that means it is September. We're in a burr month. Fall has fallen, and I am ready. So we're going to stick with that creepy, ominous feel. If you want to create a creepy, ominous tone, then use intentionally ominous, creepy words. Use words like dark and slithering and shadows, objects and adjectives and all of these things that contribute to that tone, and then in the midst include the occasional analogy. Let me give you some examples here. One book that I read recently was The September House by Carissa Orlando, which is a horror story. I don't read a ton of horror, but it is now in the rotation. So at the creepiest part of this book, so this is a trigger warning for anybody who doesn't really like creepy stuff. Skip ahead about 15 seconds. There was a ghoul living in the basement that jumped like a jumping spider with the limbs positioned the same way. I was horrified. I really had a hard time getting through that section of the book because it was so horrifyingly creepy. And the main way that Carissa Orlando established that level of creepy visual, just that horrifying tone, was the analogy. It was an incredible analogy. It was very well placed. It makes me feel sick to think about it even now. It was just really, really well done. She got the point across that she was trying to get across very well. Now, a pro tip, if you have a hard time coming up with fresh and interesting analogies, consider personification. Personification is giving human attributes to non-human things. So that can be an item, that can be a building, that can be a concept, or what have you. So personification, one of the easiest ways to create personification, which is a type of metaphor, is to use vivid verbs. So use human verbs to describe non-human things. So consider these active verbs and consider what you could connect these to and how that would change the tone of your story. Sang, crouched, bled, danced, glared. Non-human things can't do all this, right? I mean, maybe a wind-up music box could dance, but in general, this pennant flag here of Gondor can't do any of these things. But if you include these vivid verbs in your description, you're automatically creating a metaphor that connects this concept with this over here. So vivid verbs are a sometimes underutilized resource in writing that is a powerhouse when it comes to fresh, vivid prose. Related to tone is settings. So you can create vivid settings with that, with analogies as well. So let's get away from the creepy stuff. I know my first concrete example was really creepy. I also recently read Bright Ruined Things by Samantha Coho. It is a Tempest inspired, so Shakespeare's played The Tempest, a Tempest inspired fantasy set in the 20s. It was a really interesting mashup. I bought this around the time I finished Laertes because I have a Dark Academia Hamlet retelling set in the 1920s, and I thought, well, I guess it's just something in the water. But I was reading this book and I came across an absolutely beautiful analogy that brought the setting to life in a way that I thought was extremely talented, so I wanted to bring that up. It's right here. She stopped on the landing, a turquoise-papered jewel box of a space, lit by the sun through a round window that opened onto the day like a porthole to the sea. Stunning. So we have a couple of metaphors there, but they're spaced apart enough and they can coexist well enough that they're not going to clash with each other. So we have the jewel box describing the space, and we have the round window like a porthole to the sea. I just stopped in my tracks. I literally remembered the page number and went, I have to talk about this because that was a banger. It also reminded me of the descriptions in F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby as well. I know many of you read this in high school. So there's a moment when Nick first meets Daisy, and the whole description is absolutely gorgeous, but one of my favorite analogies is, it's a metaphor this time, no like or as. It says that the breeze comes through the windows and blows the curtains up toward the wedding cake of a ceiling. And you can picture exactly what that is. It's white, it has all of that ornamentation, and it goes up in tiers. I mean, I haven't gotten over that, and I read it in high school. So, yes, you can create not only ominous, creepy tones and spaces and settings, but you can create really beautiful, unique ones as well that can create awe in the person who's reading it without you having to say, it was so beautiful, I just gasped or whatever. You can describe the space with analogies and get across that same awe-inspiring feeling, which is a cool power to have as a writer. Now, metaphors and similes can be used for more things than setting the tone, more things than creating vivid settings. You can also have longer metaphors. If they're long enough, then they become symbols in the story. Now, symbolism is another word that maybe you haven't thought too much about since school, but symbolism does not need to be literary. It does not need to be super obvious, like an allegory. It doesn't need to be like the Chronicles of Narnia or anything like that. It can add a layer that can create foreshadowing. It can offer an image that's shorthand for an important person or place or concept in your story. If you're writing a romance, for example, there can be some sort of object that is connected to maybe the couple's first date, and that represents their relationship kind of throughout. And if something happens to it, then you know that things are going badly.
I love Fern! It's dead!
So kind of along similar lines anyway, in George Orwell's 1984, there is a glass paperweight with a piece of coral inside, and the meaning of it changes throughout the course of the story, but it ends up representing Winston's relationship with Julia and the sort of relative safety that he feels there and in the space that they find. You don't need to know much about 1984 to surmise that things do not go well for that paperweight or for them. But it is a potent symbol of this beauty and stability that people want and can't have. So we have a literary example there. So I said that symbolism does not need to be literary or highbrow. I know several of the examples that I gave are more literary. But consider the original cover for Twilight by Stephanie Meyer, right? It has that apple that the hands are holding out, representing, symbolizing, being a metaphor for temptation and falling for darkness, if you will. So you can use symbols and extended metaphors in a wide variety of ways. If you don't want to use a symbol all the way through a book because you just don't feel the need for that, that's perfectly fine. I have many books with no symbols that I've really consciously thought about. But what you can do with metaphors is kind of chew on them a little bit longer. If you consider, for example, the jewel box analogy that I gave you from Bright Ruined Things, it not only describes this really beautiful room, but you could expand upon that if you wanted to and emphasize the beauty of the people within that needed to be protected or something like that. This is not the direction that Samantha Coho goes, but you could do that, kind of comparing them to the jewels within. You could create a feeling of being trapped. You're in this enclosed box, right? You could really chew on the metaphor a little bit more just in the moment to give it a little bit more oomph than just a passing comment, although that can be powerful too. So what I recommend that you do if you want to start incorporating some of this into your writing to make your prose fresher, more dynamic, pack more punch in fewer words, try using different analogies to describe one thing and see how much it changes the tone of that sentence, of that scene. It is wild how powerful it can be to just use a different analogy for something. So yeah, again, if you're a little bit unsure where to start with the location, a main location in your story, like a house, and start applying those vivid verbs to it. The house watched, the house crumbled, the house welcomed, the house, start using those verbs and you'll see what I'm talking about. It ends up being really fun and awesome in my opinion. I love this because it is so powerful and yet everybody can do it. Even like elementary kids can start to put these ideas together and come up with some really interesting analogies. So I hope this was helpful for you. The power of analogies is huge. Make sure to follow me, subscribe if you are not subscribed already, like this video if you like it, and I will be back next week. All right, have a good life, be of good cheer, bye.